Welcome to NTS Perspectives, a podcast brought to you by the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. We speak with experts from Asia Pacific and beyond to share their views on pressing NTS issues ranging from climate change, food security, the energy transition, biosecurity, planetary health, and women, peace, and security. It has been 25 years since the UNSC Resolution 1325 was adopted, addressing the impact of conflict and war on women and the need for women's full and equal participation in conflict resolution, peacebuilding, peacekeeping, and humanitarian efforts. The resolution establishes that the equality and representation of women is vital for the maintenance of international peace and security. The Women, Peace and Security agenda has resonated globally, with 107 countries and territories adopting national WPS action plans between 2000 and 2023. According to UN Women, in Asia and the Pacific, 14 countries have put in place national WPS action plans. In today's episode, we will be unpacking China's engagement with the WPS agenda and women's empowerment on the international stage and domestically. While China has not adopted a national WPS action plan, it has endeavored to advance women's empowerment, particularly in its diplomatic efforts. We are honored to have with us Ms Peixuan Xie, Humanitarian Affairs Analyst at Doctors Without Borders, or MSF, as our guest. Peixuan has had extensive research experience focused on WPS norms and its intersectionality with emerging issues in global peace and security, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. Hi, Peixuan.
Hi, Danielle. Thank you for having me.
So, could you share with us on your research and your work with Doctors Without Borders?
Sure. I'll start with what I did before MSF. So before joining MSF, I was working with Peace Research Institute Frankfurt in Germany, focusing on gender, peace, and conflict in the region of Asia Pacific, broadly speaking. And maybe less broadly speaking, my interest was particularly the Asian encounters with the global gender and conflict agendas and norms. So WPS quite naturally is a primary lens to look at this sort of interactions. My research back then looked a lot at the interactions that different actors have operating in and out of the WPS agenda, while at the same time also critically unpacking the agenda itself as a much politicized item. So it's in this process that I thought, why is nobody looking at China? For various reasons. It sits on the Security Council as a permanent member. It has been posing itself as this alternative norm maker in the international governance structure. And in fact, it does not proactively, but relatively actively engage with the agenda itself, at least at a rhetoric level at the UN. So the question was, okay, if there's this gap, so maybe I am in a okay position to inquire into this. That's why I thought, okay, China and WPS would be something interesting to look at. Maybe a bit more on MSF or Doctors Without Borders then. So MSF Hong Kong hosts a small unit of humanitarian affairs analysts, and I am one of them. And being placed in Hong Kong, we have a Asia Pacific orientation, or so to speak, a regional focus. So that determines the very important part of our job is to analyze and monitor emerging humanitarian trends, discourse, and actors coming from this region to inform better movement understanding of the changing humanitarian landscape in this part of the world that for historical reasons we have had less analytical attention on. So China is one, Korea, Japan, ASEAN, and of course you have Myanmar that has just been the center of many humanitarian organizations' attention in this region. In this process, we are looking to engage with existing dynamics, existing frameworks and mechanisms that can be mobilized for enhanced humanitarian action in this region. So here again, although MSF is not formally engaging with women, peace and security, I think at least at my personal capacity as a humanitarian affairs analyst, our analysis unit is exploring, the relevance of especially the relief and recovery pillar for humanitarian aid in this region. And this is also against the background that ASEAN has all these existing high-level commitment on the women, peace and security agenda. As an analyst, what we are well positioned to do is to explore what sort of WPS-based strategic humanitarian engagement is possible within ASEAN for Myanmar. For instance, we thought WPS would fit quite well into the Troika mechanism, as many of the Troika states, they are also in the meantime having high-level commitment on WPS. You have the Philippines, you have Indonesia, and Malaysia quite recently also developed its NAP. So we thought, okay, when other things are not exactly cutting it anymore, maybe this is something that will open different doors for us, or they're leading to the same final goal of the assistance to Myanmar. Curiously, maybe, I don't know if this has been taken upon sufficiently in the region, but there are actually quite a lot of connections between WPS and IHL, at least in terms of their policy design, the architecture of how these bodies of norms are laid out. Like, for instance, in the Fundamental Security Council Resolution 1325, there were actually explicit references made to IHL to call upon states to adhere to the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols. And then again in Resolution 1888 and 1889, references on condemnation of violation of IHL committed against women and girls, and general protection again to civilians, including women and girls, and sexual violence that's explicitly prohibited under IHL. WPS has the potential to be something that's very handy for our humanitarian engagement in ASEAN.
It's encouraging to hear that WPS has been a good entry point and also been embedded in analysis and work that you've been doing in Southeast Asia. Okay, so we'll move on to WPS and China. So to start with a broad overview, in your view, what has been the progress by Asia-Pacific countries in the Women, Peace and Security or WPS agenda? And how has China fared in advancing WPS?
Okay, that's some very good questions to lay the ground. I have always thought Asia Pacific is such a dynamic region for the more normative, discursive side of WPS norm development. So here I'm just going to skip the obvious things, like we have in this region quite a few countries with national action plans. We have the ASEAN Regional Plan of Action, and we have wide engagement with the agenda from civil society actors, and not to mention all these programs, trainings, diplomatic engagement. But I think really the added value of Asia Pacific lies in the discourse or the sense making of WPS coming from this region have the tendency to challenge two main drawbacks of WPS implementation that is quite often visible in global north. One is it has much less this outward orientation. So it does not portray conflict or insecurity as wicked problems elsewhere. I guess this discrepancy is easy to understand because, I mean, for instance, when the Philippines is making its national action plan, it naturally focuses on the insecurities that's within the country instead of talking about insecurities in, I don't know, Sudan or Haiti. So I think, yeah, that's quite refreshing because I think it's deeply problematic for a national action plan to portray all these grand structures in this developed country, but all the points of implementation somewhere else. I'm seeing less of that in the regional WPS implementation. And the second thing, I think, perhaps quite connected to the first one, is the definition of security and, to some extent, peace and conflict. I think the regional NAPs, for instance, they don't shine away from talking about displacement, for instance, and especially displacement within the national boundaries. Here, Philippines is another example. They also include cutting-edge issues like environment and climate security. I know maybe Western NAPs are also now catching up on this. But then something else that I think are quite unique to the regional context is this marriage between WPS and socioeconomic security. So, of course, the implication of this particular tendency merits a whole other discussion. But at least I think it challenges what constitutes security. So it's not just militarized security and what peace means in our region. It's not just an absence of war, but also environmental peace, for instance, and what types of violence, what types of participation count as violence, as participation. So I think, yeah, that's the normative progress or the normative value I think the Asian encounters with the agenda could really bring to the broader discussion. And I think Asia Pacific is also a good place to examine this center periphery dynamic in WPS knowledge production. If we think about Thailand, right? This provides a good comparison to how WPS, like epistemological sense making of WPS, is done in the West. It's usually led by the state and academia, think tanks in knowledge production. Whereas I think Asia Pacific, as many countries often being more on the receiving end of external WPS programming, CSOs in this process are rising to become the more front line of interpreting WPS and really integrating the meaning into the local reality. My take on this has always been when and if we are going to talk about China and WPS, any meaningful discussion probably only stays at the foreign policy level, usually at multilateral platforms. So there's a Chinese feminist IR scholar once, I think, very accurately said WPS is a diplomatic vocation for China. Again, just to echo Smita Basu's point on gender as a national interest, I think China is a perfect example of that. I think WPS, like many other international agendas, it's considered a suitable exercising ground for China's other overarching objectives in international governance. So there are some other scholars from China. They are trying to categorize the Chinese effort on women's social, legal, economic empowerment. And I don't think this understanding is reflected in China's WPS deliberations neither, because whenever it happens, it's always something more in the foreign policy sphere that would take it up. It would never be the Ministry of Finance. It would never be the Ministry of Social Welfare, the National Committee on Women and Children. It won't be them. I think China mostly tried to advance WPS at a foreign policy level. And this advancement, needs to say, is not overall endorsement or overall rejection. It's very nuanced in the sense that its posture is really overall agree that having WPS something that aspires to integrate gender in all aspects of peace and security is important, but it shouldn't have this explicit connection to human rights, especially civil and political rights. And it should not become a human rights mandate. And on top of that, there's also an element of strategic grafting to suit WPS to China's own alternative order-making efforts. So I think, that goes back to how China is an ambivalent norm actor with different layers of motivation in engaging with WPS.
Just recently, at our webinar on 25 years of WPS in the Indo-Pacific, you've spoken on China's somewhat dual stance. On one hand, wanting to promote itself as a global model for women's empowerment, but also looking to establish a new normative understanding of WPS. So could you share with us on what is different about China's approach to WPS and also gender equality?
China's approach to WPS, maybe a good disclaimer is it's not entirely different. It's not smashingly different, but just overall quite different in the sense that it combines several different elements that are not very usual in other countries' WPS agency. In terms of China's approach to the protection pillar and relief and recovery pillar, it kind of largely the same, but the difference really kicks in when it comes to participation and prevention. And these differences can be broadly categorized under two overarching tenets. One is development, another is non-intervention. So I will cover development first. In China's peace agency or understanding of peace, poverty and lack of resources are often at the root cause of modern conflict. And the solution then lies in economic development and empowerment on the basis of equality or resources. This is the essence of development-driven peace. Under this overarching principle, on WPS specifically, China then contends that women's economic empowerment and development, along with the realization of other more economic and social rights, would facilitate women's meaningful participation in peace processes, in post-conflict restructuring process, especially in terms of contribution to economic productivity. This would be central to the realization of the prevention pillar. It has gone so far at one of the WPS open debates to sort of quite subtly rebrand WPS, Women, Peace and Security, to Women, Peace and Development. And it has also been quite consistent on, how economic development should be integrated, if not be the leading factor of the UN's interagency coordinated WPS efforts. So I think this push on development is quite pronounced. In other WPS deliberations, I think, for instance, ECOWAS, they also made pretty explicit reference to the importance of economic development for WPS. But I think China is still at another level of trying to embed development as really the central pillar to WPS instead of just an enabler. And the second thing that's China specific, I think, is the state and UN and CSO triangle. It holds quite firm on the ground of sovereignty. And on that basis, if anything happens, if any catastrophic atrocity happens and intervention is really needed, then everything needs to happen at the UN level with some level of sovereign consent. In this process, civil society organizations should be limited to a supplementary role. So the other side of the non-intervention thesis is, again, state centrism. But maybe what makes it stand out from traditional donor countries is, well, first of all, they seem to be a bit more comfortable doing WPS bilaterally. Like, I'm aware of this partnership between Australia and ASEAN, or Australia and Thailand, New Zealand and Indonesia. So I think they are a bit more comfortable doing substantial programming. But China, interestingly, who's usually a bit more comfortable doing things bilaterally, when it comes to WPS, prefers that things stay at the UN level. Now, this is also quite curious because ASEAN also harbors the same sort of suspicion towards external intervention, right? But ASEAN countries have more comfortable relationship with CSOs, whereas China is just very wary of INGOs, especially when they step in such political matters as women, peace, and security.
Over the past decades, China has grown to be the top contributor of financial and human resources to UN's peacekeeping operations out of 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. So has China embedded WPS in its peacekeeping and humanitarian responses?
At the UN level, Chinese female peacekeepers are often employed as an example of China's efforts on WPS. But curiously, a WPS grounding is not observable in China's deliberations on peacekeeping. So peacekeeping is usually used as an example for WPS, but WPS is not really integrated in peacekeeping structural design. There's not much WPS reference or deliberate, connections made to a certain WPS direction. But this is not to say that female peacekeepers are not celebrated in China's own perspective of its peacekeeping engagement. But it does feel from time to time that this is done more from a PR angle in ways that resemble PR more than anything else. Because if we drill into the actual numbers, as of this year, as of August 2025, China dispatched a batch of 1,876 peacekeepers. And out of all these peacekeepers, 67 are female. So, they are usually celebrated. Like, if you follow the official social media account of Chinese peacekeeping, they would quite often, I would say, have communications about the outstanding work done by female peacekeepers. But again, during one of the open debates, Chinese female peacekeepers were talked about in this way, that it is quote, "It is more important to leverage women's natural advantages in the protection of marginalized groups and community communications." They're described as, quoting again, assuming important roles in medical, education, hunger, and poverty reduction programs. So I think it's a fantastic thing that female peacekeepers are deployed and their participation is highlighted. But we also need to be careful not to essentialize their contribution to keeping the peace to things that are, non-combative or more like social service delivery. And similar dynamics exists in the humanitarian sphere. I think like China gives a lot of aid and increasingly touching upon things to do with gender equality and women's empowerment. But you more often see small scale assistance programs for it, like maybe education programs for women before the Taliban, or health kits delivery to female refugees in Cox's Bazar, or dispatch of medical teams for HPV screening. But quite rarely or never, or if ever, you would see more substantial programming on, for instance, conflict-related sexual violence. So, yeah, I think it's not paid attention to, but also not very substantially.
Do you think China is aiming to position itself as a global leader on WPS?
I think China is most likely to remain as this ambivalent actor on WPS. Because if we would bear in mind that WPS is really nothing more than an exercising ground for China to, first of all, advance its other overarching objectives, to have reputation boost. I think if we just put it in a plain language, I think it would be difficult for anyone to position themselves as a leader of something that they are still contesting, right? Like there are still things that China wants to contest about the WPS agenda, and this is on top of not having the map, yeah, straightforward like that. When you don't have a national action plan, it will be quite difficult to position as a leader. I think this is also interesting because I don't think China is allergic to making national action plans of international norms. Actually, there's a lot. I did a bit of research on this. There's a lot of national action plans on climate mitigation, carbon emission, health, even women's rights or gender equality. Something there, but there's just nothing on WPS. And I think this probably has more to do with China does not consider itself, or it doesn't want to be considered as a conflict prone or conflict affected context. This much is very clear, I think. Whenever this comes up, China does not consider itself as facing acute risk of armed conflict in the near future. The interpretation there would be this is an internal affair.
Has China leveraged on soft power and diplomacy on WPS, and what regions has it been most effective and why?
While reviewing all the existing speeches and debates on WPS from the Chinese mission to the UN, I think the most references were made on Sub-Saharan Africa and MENA, and to a lesser extent Afghanistan. But these are the regions that have surfaced the most in China's deliberation on WPS. And very often they are from the angles of humanitarian protection, aid inequity. So like more aid from the international community should be going into these countries, and socioeconomic impact on women and girls under unilateral sanction. I think this one as well, not directly on WPS, but Gaza again is a place where China tends to have the most talking points related to female civilians. And I don't know if you remember this episode, that I think it was in 2023, that China chaired this Security Council briefing inviting UN Women, UNICEF, and UNFPA on the situation of women and children in Gaza. And then the Israeli representative tried to interrupt them, and then China gave Israel a reprimand. So I think, yeah, the diplomacy on WPS definitely demonstrates a focus on Africa and Middle East, and on topics that China would usually feel more comfortable to engage with or feel more comfortable to challenge. I think it's worth saying that with China's bid to become like a representative or a leader of sorts in the global south, global north constellation, it's likely that other members of the global south community might see the value of, standing with China on this alternative WPS perspectives, and in exchange of a political economic partnership. So I feel like this definitely needs monitoring going forward.
Domestically, how is women's empowerment and gender equality framed in China?
Gender equality is quite straightforward because there is constitutional provision on the equality between men and women. It's designated that women enjoy equal rights with men in all spheres of life, including political, economic, cultural, social, and family. So I think that's the minimum ground for gender equality in China. And when it comes to women's empowerment, I think on paper it is also about empowerment in possibly all walks of social political life. But I think very often it's just understood in a social, legal, economic way. On the political side, so China very recently convened this Global Women's Summit, where top leadership made the call for women's political participation. But I think this would take time to catch up with the gap in reality. For instance, the highest political decision-making body, the Political Bureau, as of now, has 0 women in there. It's a leadership of 24 officials. Women's empowerment in the political sphere is gonna take time to catch up. But as China enters an aging, its population enters this aging stage, personally, I fear that there will be perceptive backlash towards the existing progress made for women's equal participation. Because if the framing of women's role is going to shift from, equal to men to more the implementer of the family harmony, the caregiver, it might be dangerous that it sets off all the progress.
It's really challenging because you can see already this trend, not just in China, but globally, in the US and even in the West as well.
Yeah.
And of course, there is that reality that our societies, or especially in, I don't want to generalize, but in more developed countries tend to have these demographic shifts and, that, it's a perennial issue that we have to deal with in a way, needing to push for women's empowerment and equality, but at the same time there's that those more traditional mindsets.
Yeah.
For the final question, what do you think is the way forward for WPS in China?
Mm. Yeah, okay. I think, after this whole conversation, we just have to return to the point that China's level of practical engagement with WPS agenda remains relatively quite low. And it's also not supported by policy compliance. I don't think there is the political will to make a nap in the foreseeable future, and gender remains a missing or essentialized element in peacekeeping, humanitarian action, and quite importantly, cross-border investment practices, because these are also the things that are leading another front of China's global engagement. So for these reasons, WPS is most likely to remain as a rhetoric space, where China maintains, I think, some overall acceptance, but would continue to challenge the more liberal cause of WPS. That said, I think there is an opportune window to engage with China on WPS a bit more, because I think China is, positioned as ready to be a norm maker, a more responsible one, in the global structure. So this is a good opportunity for China to step in and up its game in both peace and security and gender equality. These two arenas are quite, by comparison, they're relatively not so controversial, right? Doing gender equality is always good for your image, and doing peace is always fantastic for your reputation. So I think if I can see it, China can probably see it too. And I guess the convening of the Global Women's Summit could sort of attest that, China is seeing opportunities maybe to become an emerging gender equality champion. And this is good for itself. So I think, maybe not particularly in WPS, but it's not entirely impossible that China would try to do more things around women's empowerment and gender equality. Especially, it would be quite easy to do with all the efforts in development cooperation, because I think under there you have a lot of things that can be considered as inducive for gender equality and empowerment. But maybe the things that would be worth watching is China is now making a set of sort of new structure for its own imagination of global governance. You have the Global Development Initiative a couple of years ago, and then you have the Global Security Initiative. And quite recently, there's a new one that's the Global Governance Initiative. So with the UN being less and less supported and properly resourced, maybe China could turn to a system that's less multilateral but more really led by China. And with that, maybe there's going to be even less the role of civil society organizations in China's WPS agency would continue to diminish. But maybe some thematic opportunities remain, like on Middle East and Africa, or on specifically Gaza, or thematically on health, education, and economic empowerment aspects of WPS.
You've been listening to NTS Perspectives, brought to you by the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And to our listeners, you can follow us for future episodes on RSIS Spotify and YouTube channels, and connect with us via RSIS LinkedIn, IG, and Facebook platforms. For more information on what we do at the NTS Center, you can visit our website at rsis.edu.sg/research/NTS-Center. Thanks for tuning in.